Welcome to Restaurant Relevance, the podcast, where the goal is to glean operational tactics for restaurant operators from data-driven research. Definitely nerding out along the way. I'm Nathan Jarvis, the host. Welcome to those of you who are tuning in. Before we dive into the show, here are the highlights and key takeaways. Takeaways for me as I'm thinking through a conversation. Obviously, it's not, we didn't talk about this a whole lot, but your paper does, right? So it's not necessarily the case that younger generations aren't interested in wine. They just, people are reached in different ways. And it may also depend on what their motivations are. I certainly have learned about this, the terminology, right? The hedonic I'd been introduced to in the past, but the eudaimonic idea, that those two motivations are important for why people may be getting into wine or trying to enjoy wine. I do think you could apply this to a range of industry applications, whether it's a tasting room or a restaurant, or some other thing. I mean, I'm not a marketing person, but I'm thinking about if you were trying to do market research or other things, this absolutely could be applied there as well. And then also, I didn't write this down, but as just the end of our conversation, I think there's some interesting applications for education on how we could use this. Again, like if I teach wine appreciation again in the future, I now want to restructure my course. And what I really want is like two sections, and I could structure it differently and see how well those work for students, and whether you could go between analytical and holistic back and forth and kind of get the best of both worlds there. In this episode, we're featuring research published in the Cornell Hospitality Quarterly entitled "Developing Wine Appreciation for New Generations of Consumers." I find this research fascinating for a couple of reasons. Number one, I actually used to teach wine appreciation, and in some of my classes, I talk to students about some of these more visual ways to help people understand wine flavors and wine profiles. I actually had some students in class that, alongside their quantitative analysis or qualitative analysis as well, they would bring in colored pencils and they would draw pictures or kind of a color profile. So this research resonates with me, and for that reason. At the same time, attracting and resonating with new generations of wine consumers is really important, both for the wine industry and also for restaurants. And so I think this research is very applicable for the show and for restaurant operators. I hope you walk away with a couple of ideas as you move forward in your wine programs. So let's jump right in. We're fortunate to have the lead author of the paper on the show today. Dr. Kathy LaTour is the Banfi Professor of Wine Education and Management and an Associate Professor of Services Marketing at the Nolan School of Hotel Administration in the S.C. Johnson College of Business at Cornell University. She received her PhD from the University of Iowa in '97, and she served as a visiting scholar in the Mind of the Market Lab at the Harvard Business School for a period of time. She was then on the faculty at the UNLV Hotel School and has now been at Cornell since 2012. She's an expert in the area of consumer learning and memory, and her work has addressed applied problems such as how marketers should approach branding, experience design, communications, and loyalty programs. Her early work considered how easily consumer memories can be distorted, and her current work looks at ways in which to strengthen experiential memories. She uses both experimental and qualitative research methods for her research. Most of her studies have involved either staging experiences or using field opportunities so that she can study factors that influence the consumption experience. She's written over 70 scientific papers and book chapters. She's also been heavily involved with the industry. At the Mind of the Market Lab, she was involved with projects involving Procter & Gamble, Coca-Cola, Disney, and the World Bank. She's also worked with industry on projects across the world, such as AstraZeneca and their messaging around Crestor, the Yum design of Pizza Hut restaurants in the UK, and with the Las Vegas Sands and the loyalty program design and communications. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Nathan. I'm so excited to be here and talk about our research. And I guess I want to give a shout out to my co-authors, Jamie Joy and Roger from Queenie, which has done a great job with his visual app. So that's the article that we're going to be mostly talking about, but then also John Dayton, who was the more kind of theoretical guide that we published research on the holistic versus the analytical approach to wine tasting. So thank you so much for being here, for letting me be here. And I really appreciate being able to talk about this research with you.
Absolutely. Yes. So for those of you tuning in, the research I just talked about is the most recent paper, but this is based on a previous paper that Dr. LaTour just referenced, where they kind of developed this holistic method, which we'll get to talk about here just momentarily. So we've got a couple of papers that this research is based on. All right, so at the very beginning, I'd like to start with a high viewpoint, kind of an overview, and then we'll dig into the details. So in just a couple of sentences, would you outline for us what your study was about and what you found?
Okay, basically my bigger research question is how do we get people, in this case, wine consumers, to engage and learn more about the product they're experiencing? And so I've looked at different ways of teaching consumers about wine, and either using, as you described, like a more visual holistic method, or the more traditional method that's used by the industry, where they're given a lexicon or vocabulary to learn about wine, and also decompose it into structural parts such as acidity and balance and tannins, and rate wine in that respect. So in this study, we look at whether or not holistic versus the analytical traditional approach leads to greater liking of the wine. And we find overall the holistic people, regardless of their motivation, they like the wine better when they draw and think about it in pictures and as a story than if they decompose and write about its structure. So that was one of the findings. And then we also found that depending upon your background and motivation, if you're just about enjoying the wine, getting the hedonics, then you don't want to think about it as deeply as the analytical method might get you to think about. So you're really just wanting in that moment to have the best experience you can. And the holistic also gets you there. It's a more emotional approach to the wine tasting. But people that have kind of this more eudaimonic approach, where they seek wine as being part of their identity, something that defines who they are, and they want to learn more and more about it. They're more comfortable because they've been exposed to the analytical methods, that they tend to rely on that. But even in that case, they get more enjoyment when they use the holistic method. So I really am for this more holistic method. I'm really interested in finding out what you found out with your students in class, because that really fascinates me.
Interesting. Yeah, so I mean, my students, most of them were there they were taking a wine appreciation class, and so they were definitely there for the knowledge, and so that's more that eudaimonic approach. But it was interesting to see that I probably had maybe 5% of my students that always did kind of a color drawing on the side, and I also had some that would outline all of their writing, so it almost became an art piece to them, and that's how they remembered things as well. So I had a couple that would talk about on exams or later on, I remember such and such, and it was because they linked what they had drawn or the colors they used to the actual like the more descriptors that they had put down on their page. So that's been my experience.
And that's what we find too, is that the drawing really serves as a mnemonic device, and so it gets you to think about it. How does the wine start? How does it feel in your mouth, and then how does it finish? And as you think about those different aspects of the experience and visually denote that on a picture, and think about it as the shape, that when you recall it or ask to recall it later, that really helps bring to mind that taste you had earlier on. So it really does help your memory of the experience.
That makes intuitive sense to me. So you start your paper with a bit of a paradox, and that's the idea that consumers want to know about wine, but at the same time are overwhelmed. And I mean, I talk about this overwhelming feeling that guests get all the time. Unfortunately, as a restaurant industry, sometimes we contribute to this through, language that's hard to understand, or wine lists that are, 100 pages long, or, all these things. But it sounds like the origin of your research is in that paradox. Is that true? And like, how did this research get started?
Well, my research, as you mentioned, the introduction has been on memory, and I'm really interested in hedonic and what we call ambiguous experiences, which are experiences that are open-ended and they can be interpreted in multiple ways. And so when you think about wine, it's like the perfect ambiguous experience, because each person, based upon if they're a super taster or not, or what kind of background, where they grew up, will have a different experience tasting the exact same wine. And so it's Constellation did a study where they found like about a third of consumers in the United States indicate that they're wine confused. And so when it comes to wine, it's very different than like evaluating orange juice. So when you drink orange juice, you smell it, it smells like oranges. When you look at wine, it's made of grapes, but most wine doesn't smell like grapes. It smells like barnyard, or, we have all these descriptors that, are things that sometimes people don't necessarily relate to, like gooseberries. Unless you grew up in the UK, that's a descriptor that is used so often for Sauvignon Blanc, but that's not something most US consumers can really relate to. Mm-hmm. And so, I have been interested in how, when we have this ambiguous experience, and people think when they have an experience, they're going to remember it better because it's like something they personally have. It's not something that they're hearing secondhand. So when you have like a wine tasting and it's a special experience, you think, oh yeah, of course, later on after I tasted this wine I like, I'll be able to identify that later. And what we have found is that people are not very good at that at all. Right. And particularly the people like in the middle, people that drink a lot of wine but haven't had like any wine training at all, think that they know a lot more than they actually do. So they become even more confused than novices who haven't had any training at all, because at least a novice knows what they don't know, versus the aficionado is kind of, I've been to Napa, all these wineries, so I must know what a good wine is. So I really became interested in, but then there are the true experts that really can, when they taste a wine, figure out the vintage and where it's from, and the varietals and the winemaking techniques, and even the wine growing techniques. And so when I did some in-depth interviews with the Master Sommeliers, I just became so fascinated, like how did they get to that point? What in their training led them to be able to do this? Because I went through the training process myself. I went through the court program and became a certified somm, but I found that, the initial kind of the wine wheel and the grid that we are given to deconstruct the wine, most people were failing, and failing to the point that most universities would not accept that as, the kind of standard you would look to, for a proper graduating class. So, what the industry was doing, got people kind of to one point, but it really wasn't getting them to like this full-on understanding of what the wine was. So I guess, that was kind of led me to this, I guess, new, different way of thinking about wine, which people like you have been thinking about for a while, more holistic, but trying to test that in a way that, shows that it does perform better in some cases, and then other cases it doesn't perform so well with other people.
And you break the consumer group kind of into two categories by their motivations, right? Are they motivated by hedonic means, which would be like pleasure seeking, versus eudaimonic? Let's make sure I'm saying that properly. A eudaimonic means, which is more like knowledge seeking, growth, etc. Did you start the project with those in mind, or how did you come to those two motivations and decide to separate people like that?
No, actually, that came kind of much later, because I guess the traditional way that we group people in marketing studies is like demographics, age, income, educational status. And, and so in the case of wine is whether or not you've had a wine class or not, or, have you drunk a lot of wine or, gone on to wine tourism and stuff like that. But when I was initially doing some of the wine studies in Las Vegas, and I was recruiting for consumers to participate in the wine studies there, I noticed I had to be very careful in how I advertise the studies, because I would advertise them, are you a wine drinker? And I would get people that, their day job was just drinking at home wine. And that wasn't really, the kind of person I was trying to recruit. And I found that, after, going to lots of tasting rooms and, talking to wine consumers, people have different motivations, and those motivations also change. They could be like on vacation and maybe they're just about hedonics, but then they come back and they want to learn more and they take a wine class. So it can be context dependent. But I found this research on the hedonic versus eudaimonic a nice way to think about people that want to learn about wine. And, some people have different goals, and it could be just the pure enjoyment, which, a lot of people, want to just learn enough so they know what they like and they get the best experience from that glass of wine that's in front of them. And then there are other people that, want to learn and study, know all the grapes, know about the winemaker and the background and, everything that went into the glass, so they can, learn more for themselves, but also probably show off to their friends and, talk about the next time they order that wine in a restaurant or have it at home, that they can, tell their friends or family something kind of a unique story about the wine. So I thought, that was kind of an interesting way to think about the different wine consumers and break them into groups, different than, I guess, the traditional way that we look at it in marketing research. Mm-hmm. And so I was lucky because at Cornell, we do have a large wine class, which 800 lucky students each semester are able to take. Yeah. So so my first study, I had people that had taken like a wine class like that or hadn't taken a wine class. So I was able to differentiate people that had some wine knowledge and had been exposed to the traditional way of approaching wine. And they hadn't been in my class, so they hadn't had the holistic yet. So they were kind of, they were just focused on that traditional analytic tool of describing right. wine in a verbal way. So it was a good context for looking at these different ways of teaching consumers about the wine.
That's awesome. I love it. And, as I was reading your paper and I've prepared for today to talk to you, I've thought about this. I thought about the way that I consume or enjoy things. My personality is definitely more on the, I enjoy it through learning about it. And anywhere we go, my wife's probably tired. Like I search out wineries and distilleries and breweries. I want to go taste new things, but it's all about the learning more about it rather than just enjoying it. And I know I have friends that, we get together and I talk about it far more than they would appreciate, because all they want to do is just enjoy. And here I am, talking about all the details. So that makes a lot of sense to me. And I could see how, as a restaurateur or maybe a tasting room manager, you probably could pretty easily identify guests by one of these two groups, right? Like you could see or quickly identify, is someone coming in for more of the knowledge or are they coming in just for the experience?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you could definitely tailor the experience depending upon, what their motivation or their goal is for that tasting.
All right. And you've built a quote unquote holistic tasting method, which we alluded to, and you've talked a little bit about, and this was research that you did prior to this initial publication. And you use this as a foundation for this study. So I'm curious as to how you came up with that holistic method, and then how did you use it in this study in contrast to the more traditional descriptive type tasting?
That's a great question. So I started by doing some in-depth interviews with master sommeliers. And so there's only about 300 or so in the world. For qualitative research, it usually interview about 10 to 12 people. And so I was lucky enough to get 12 master sommeliers that were based in Las Vegas and San Francisco and New York City. And spoke to them, and I had them bring in images that represent their thoughts and feelings about how they became an expert taster. And so the interview involved visual images that they brought in themselves, and we used those visual images to kind of drive what we discussed during the 90 minutes I talked to them about their experiences. And so one of the things that came out, and with these kind of interviews, you kind of have a plan of where you want to go with the interview, but you really let the interviewee kind of drive the discussion points. So I didn't want to impose my own personal beliefs about the analytic or holistic. And I didn't even know what that holistic actually, what meant or was operationalized at that time I was doing the interviews. I just knew there had to be a different way than I was learning in the Court of Master Sommelier training sessions I was doing. And so I had them talk about what was effective for them in their learning method. And so a lot of things that which I think people have talked about in wine appreciation before is, going to the grocery store and smelling things like the lime and the lemon and getting these cross-modal representations so that when you smell a wine, you have different associations to the taste. They also talked about the grid, and everyone brought up the grid in some way. But they talked about initially how important it was to have that structure to understand the wine, but then over time you had to kind of move away from that structure and impose your own kind of language and imagery into the experience. And so that's where to me it got interesting. Well, what does that mean, when you impose yourself or your imagery in? And one of the masters I talked to talked about becoming one with the wine and immersing himself into the glass of wine, and that the grid was kind of something that more distanced him from the experience of the wine taste. And having something that was more imagery based or thinking about it as a story, helped them kind of see the wine in the fuller, more holistic way. And then I had another master sommelier who had synesthesia, which is basically you experience tastes in images or colors. And so when he tasted professionally wine, he would initially kind of see a shape of it on his nose. And then when he tasted it, it would kind of start moving around like in a psychedelic type movie. And it would become more of a visual story. So I thought, there were two important aspects that they were basically telling me, is that you needed to have this overall holistic structure, like a story, to have the wine have a beginning, middle, and an end. And also the use of visual aspects was really important, moving away from just the verbal descriptors that are used so often in tasting notes. So I developed a way to teach consumers as they're tasting wine to draw a shape of the wine. So, think about it as you initially smell it, and then you have the initial sip, and then how it feels on your mid palate, back palate, and then, how long it finishes. And so I give them examples of a really short round, really fat circle. And I tell them, well, think about this as, one kind of wine, and then another wine could be like a straight arrow that goes on and on and on. And a lot of wines are kind of somewhere in between those two. So, think about, does it start big and really fluffy, or is it, very angular, and then it softens up? So we talk through some potential shapes, and I give them crayons, and it is going to be, it's kind of fun. It's like going back to kindergarten, I bring in my crayons, and they draw, and it's really becomes kind of a fun overall experience. So that's the holistic learning approach. The analytic is very similar to what the court does, where give them a wine aroma wheel that has a lexicon of the aromas that are most typical in wine, that were developed by Ann Noble. So it has things like fruity, and you can choose if it's berry, and if it's berry, is it blackberry, raspberry, strawberry, or is it a tree fruit like cherry, apricot, peach? And then it goes into other things like woody, and is it burnt type woody, like coffee or burnt toast? And so going into some descriptors that they might not necessarily come to mind when they think about the wine, but then when they have those verbal descriptors in front of them, it helps them kind of place, what they're tasting. And then they also give them the Court of Master Sommelier's grid, where they assess, the color and then the aroma and, what's on the palate and the alcohol level and everything like that. So I contrast, and I call that the analytic versus the holistic is the drawing method.
Wow. I'm sure being able to talk with the Master Somms was quite an experience, and to hear how each one of them experiences it and does it differently, I'm sure was quite interesting.
Yeah, it was interesting that, there were a lot of differences, but then looking at the commonalities of their experiences, and a lot of them were musicians or had some artistic tendencies. So there were these, overarching, we think of like wine is one, category of expertise, but they really kind of crossed over to other aspects of their lives too. So that was kind of cool to hear too.
Indeed. All right, so you built this holistic method, and then of course you have the more analytical method based on the Quartz method. So in this study, you brought participants in, and then you either assigned them to the holistic method or the analytical method, I think.
Yes.
And then you had them evaluate a number of things, and then you made your conclusions as to the effectiveness of the two methods based on generation and other things. So what are some of the major findings from your study here?
So one of the major findings from our first study, we found that and this is the study where we developed the holistic method, is that for people that were aspiring to be experts, that, breaking away from that traditional analytic to more of a holistic helped them remember the wine better. And then aficionados that wanted to become experts learned more and were able to remember more when they used the holistic method. But we found that novices, initially performed better, at least for memory tests, when they had the more analytic method, because they really didn't have any knowledge about how to deduce and describe the wine. So having that basic way of having that structure was helpful for them. So what we didn't look at in that initial paper was, how do people actually experience and enjoy the wines, which is like, I think in the hospitality we're most interested in is that overall kind of feeling and the emotion. And so, just by kind of gauging like people's reactions to the holistic versus the analytic, which I begin the paper with a quote that says, it's from Melanie McBride, which I think is a great quote. I think wine is one of the most definitively ludic objects around, which is why it's a drag that so many so-called educational systems for learning about it suck the joy right out of it as an outcome of bad pedagogy that prioritizes rote memorization over inquiry and play. So I think that's what when we think we have this overall view, like an expert is very analytical and they're very systematic in their thinking, and that's what really the industry has followed through. But it really kind of does suck out all the fun out of the experience, which, I mean, so, there's a lot of paradoxes in the learning literature. It's like, if you want people to retain and have that fun experience, how do you do it in a way that also gives them that kind of positive emotional experience? And so one of the main findings in the study is that even people who might say that they like the analytic and have been exposed to it before still like the wine more when they use the holistic versus the analytical approach. But we did find people that had the wine tasting class and had the analytical approach in the past were more, I guess, eudaimonic in their approach. They view themselves as aspiring to become more of a wine expert. And so they said that they liked the analytic approach to learning better, and it was more consistent with what they had been exposed to in the past. And the novices, even though they did better with the analytic as far as their memory, they overall liked the wine better, when they had the holistic approach. So I guess the takeaway from that study is, yeah, there are some benefits, at least initially, to getting consumers to analyze, but I think there's a lot more positives, particularly at the experiential end, with the holistic method.
Yeah, so that's what's really occurring to me was if I'm an operator, whether it's a tasting room or a restaurant or anywhere, and the holistic method seems like a better approach if I really want them to enjoy the experience and particularly to enjoy the wine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and while we focus more on like the visual and the drawing, and some people think that that's kind of like, how do you actually do that in a restaurant or
Right.
a tasting room? There are other ways to think about wine holistically. Some of our Master Somms talked about having like a 3-minute elevator speech, that you, or even kind of less than that. You're going up from like floor 1 to floor 10, and you need to describe the wine very quickly to someone. Or having like you're taking a shower and you're singing a song, and what are the most important parts of that song, what would that title of the song be? So there are different ways to think about like what holistic and the story means. I think the drawing is a fun aspect, but it does require a lot of moving parts, with the crayons and the paper and everything. And we had thought that one thing that restaurant people could do was to have like an etch a sketch, in the the restaurant, where the sommelier could come to the table and say, well, draw me, your ideal wine, and then he could he or she could try to like match it to the shape that the consumer drew. But I mean, yeah, there's a lot of fun things I think that can be done, breaking away from the more traditional analytic approach.
Right. And so then in your second part, you kind of did this through an app that allows consumers to draw a wine profile called Quinny. And I was looking this up online. It's and if you're listening, tuning in, you can look this up. It's QUINI, I believe. And it allows, there's like 5 different aspects: the eye, the nose, the mouth, the finish, and the like your final opinion. And it kind of lets you, using your finger, extend or retract kind of these petals and add colors a little bit. So y'all started by looking at their data, 3 years of data, and then you surveyed 81 users of the app, and this was in 2019. So this is pre-pandemic. Yes. How did that work out? Like, what did you find there?
Well, first of all, I was really excited when I found Quinny, because majority of the apps kind of follow the traditional, rated on a 10-point scale or a 100-point scale, or, find the verbal descriptors. And so when I found Quinny, and Roger has just been so open with, working with us on, doing projects like this, it was very cool. And you could see, like, from, I think 2017, there weren't many users. It's a, relatively newer app, and we did break it down by generational use. And I just want to preface by people, so some people say, well, looking at generations that's not necessarily the best way of breaking consumer groups. But I think in the case of wine users, it's not necessarily the people themselves are different generationally. It's the world that they grew up in, and the environment in which they're experiencing wine is different for a Gen Z, versus a baby boomer. So and I'm a Gen X, for example. And when I grew up, my parents drank cocktails. It wasn't, necessarily the norm to have wine at dinner in the United States. Wine didn't really become, part of, it wasn't even part of, really well known into like the 1970s, and then maybe the 1980s, started to take off. But so the people in Gen Z and the millennials did have parents that probably drank wine more regularly at home, but they also had more options available to them. You could buy it in a supermarket. and now, online and all these apps, and so there's all these different experiences that are associated with wine. And so I think looking at the generations kind of helps us to determine like what in the external environment of the industry, what's going on that's influencing the way that these newer consumers, how do we get them to engage with wine? So I don't think Quinny is necessarily just for like the millennials or Gen Z. They have a lot of baby boomers and Gen X users also. And I think this visual method is definitely something that crosses generational lines. But I think when we think of like the millennials, we think of Instagram and a lot of these more visual ways of presenting information. And so having an app that actually displays like holistically what the taste is, and that you can actually manipulate yourself. It's not as cumbersome as like bringing a piece of paper and a crayon, to a restaurant. And the nice thing about the app, it saves it for later on. And they do have like a summary that kind of takes the overall holistic image of the taste of the wine for you. So you can, go back and see how you rated it and, find wines that have similar characteristics to it.
So did you find generational differences? And if so, it sounds like from what you just said, you're attributing that a little more to the environment in which those generations grew up rather than some sort of inherent like biological tie to the generation itself, right?
Yeah, and I think like my generation, which is like a smaller generation than the baby boomers and millennials, has got kind of been forgotten in the wine industry. And Liz Toch at Sonoma State has recently done some research showing that Generation X, really has an important, has been overlooked as far as the wine industry goes. And so what we found is that, Generation X, they were, because they're in their late 40s, 50s, and, early 60s, that they really had more time on their hands now and were able to travel, I guess when we were able to travel, but they were doing things like wine tourism. And so they were getting into wine in a very different way than, maybe the, Generation Z and the millennials that might have been exposed, to wine in like a wine class at Cornell or one of your classes, where they've learned, more of the, traditional approach and, are still wanting to continue that wine learning journey.
Right. Okay. So there were some differences, but it seems like that definitely the holistic method resulted in, regardless of the generation, people liking the wine a little bit better. And it also seemed like, as I was reading your paper there, that holistic method created kind of an emotional response to the wine and the experience more than the analytical method did. Is that right? So the emotions played a role there.
Yeah, and the Quinny app, itself kind of combines them both. So I mean, it does like break down, the aroma and the palate, in different ways, but it does it in a visual way. So it's hard to kind of like tease apart the analytic and holistic, but it is overall, I think, a nice visual tool for getting information about the wine.
Okay. And for those of you tuning in, particularly on the audio version here, so I'll provide a link if you wanted to go look up Quinny. But again, the way it looks very much like the petals of a flower. And where I'm going with this is, because my next question relates to, is this something an operator could do? I'm imagining myself as let's say a tasting room manager. I could create kind of a petal or similar black and white diagram and then provide colored pencils or crayons or something. And that would be a way that I could have guests, while tasting or in it, a tasting experience, could kind of sketch out or color out kind of their ideal profile or what they thought the wine tasted like. To me, that's kind of the first application that comes to mind. But are there other applications of how a restaurant operator could, or a tasting room operator could use this?
I think, have you been to Vino Volo? I mean, I guess when we traveled, it's one of like a wine bar that's in a lot of airports. Mm-hmm. And so they have like these visual tasting cards, which will have like a wine described as, either big and bold, or fruity, or light. And so they have and they describe it, they have the words, but then they also have kind of colors and images that are associated with that. So I think, instead of, just having the verbal descriptors, having, some kind of imagery that sets like what you would expect when you taste the wine, can be helpful for the consumer to better understand the wine.
Okay, so if I'm not interested in actually having the guests do any sort of drawing at the table, or that whole endeavor,
well, I think that would be very cool. But yeah, I think there are other ways to to go about it also.
Yeah. Okay. So I could use images or pictures or other visual aspects. That would be one extension of this research to try to resonate with guests, and whether it's on a wine menu or maybe an app or something along those lines.
Right. Right.
Okay. And so I'm curious, if you were a restaurant operator or a wine bar operator, how would you be using this research?
So I would definitely, I guess, not do the traditional, overwhelming, wine list that, lists things by country. I mean, I think there have been a lot of, kind of cool variations of that where people look by wine style, and I think so. The next phase of that would be kind of to visually, show the wine styles, that the consumer can see if you've got like this big, circle, a bold flavor, or do you have something that has like more structure, like a champagne that goes on and on, so they can, see and maybe pair, that accordingly with the food that they're tasting. So if you're having something really fatty, maybe you need that structure of a champagne to cut through it, or if you are having something that's that's also kind of, I don't know, big and bold, that you need something like a steak would need like a Malbec or something to be able
Right.
to pair with it. So I think it can be used in that way to like pair foods and wines, and visually describe the wines. And I think also once people have like a wine style they like, they might always order New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, for instance, that once they know that wine, and then they think deeper about what the structure is. And a lot of people think, well, Sauvignon Blanc doesn't have any sugar, but actually New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, has quite a bit of sugar to kind of balance the acidity. So once they figure out like what is it about that wine, and maybe visually map the taste structure for them, finding a similar wine that has a similar type of shape profile to kind of substitute once in a while, so they get some variety, so they're not always
Right.
drinking the same thing.
And I'm also thinking about the implications for this as wine educators. There's if students, whether they're in a university setting or some other setting, are wanting to learn something, obviously that's more of a knowledge growth mindset, and yet you still want them to enjoy the experience. So, is it, and you said that people who are complete novices benefited from at least some description and some analysis on the front end. So is there some combination of providing like a bare bones structure of analysis and then shifting to a holistic method to go back to analysis? I'm kind of curious how we, as educators, we might be able to use this.
I think that would be really interesting to test, and that's something that's kind of more involved, and that's definitely something that has to be in person and experienced over time. So not something I could do during COVID, but I think it would be kind of cool to because there's like different, competing hypotheses. On one hand, the holistic would say, well, get them really excited and interested first, and then draw them in, and then teach them the analytic, and then maybe go back to holistic, versus, the analytic. I mean, the traditional approach says get them that structure first analytically, and then you can kind of shift them to more of this holistic. So I think it might have different outcomes depending upon if you want better memory or memorization of the wines, or if you're looking for trying to build someone's to be a wine lover for the rest of their lives. They might want to start engaged holistically first, and then kind of deep analytic later.
Right. And now I'm just thinking here, does this have any relationship with personality? I mean, people who are more visual learners versus more auditory. I don't think you looked at, or maybe you did, or you're looking at that in the future. Because I would think that if I'm more of a visual learner, the drawing might be better for me than just learning words. I don't know. Did you consider that, or is there any evidence out there in the literature?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that I was just looking at my Twitter, and there's areas of psychology that have been debunked in the last 10 20 years, and this idea of that someone is necessarily a visual or auditory learner. We might think that's the case, but I think that we all learn through multiple modalities, and there isn't just one way to best teach people. And I did kind of consider that by asking people after they did the drawing or they did the analytic approach, like, how well do you think later you'll remember the wine? And people really underestimated how much they thought they learned with the holistic, and they said things like, well, I can't really draw very well, and I don't think this worked for me. But even in the case where they said that, they still had better memory than people that had the more verbal approach. So I think people don't think that they're good artists, but I think within everyone there's a little bit of an artist, and I think bringing the crayons kind of helps people it's less intimidating than giving them maybe colored pencils, so that the crayons kind of bring back to the kindergarten where there were big kind of clumsy ways of portraying things.
Wow, fascinating. Awesome. Anything else from your study you would like to throw in here?
No, I think you did a great job covering everything. And I really appreciate your insights and how the industry would incorporate this, because that's something I continually want to think about and develop as I move on.
Absolutely. It was wonderful to have you on here. So takeaways from me as I'm thinking through our conversation. Obviously, we didn't talk about this a whole lot, but your paper does, right? So it's not necessarily the case that younger generations aren't interested in wine. They just, people are reached in different ways. And it may also depend on what their motivations are. I certainly have learned about this, the terminology, right? The hedonic I'd been introduced to in the past, but the eudaimonic idea, that those two motivations are important for why people may be getting into wine or trying to enjoy wine. I do think you could apply this to a range of industry applications, whether it's a tasting room or a restaurant, or some other thing. I mean, I'm not a marketing person, but I'm thinking about if you were trying to do market research or other things, this absolutely could be applied there as well. And then also, I didn't write this down, but as just the end of our conversation, I think there's some interesting applications for education on how we could use this. Again, like if I teach wine appreciation again in the future, I now want to restructure my course. And what I really want is like 2 sections, and I could structure it differently and see how well those work for students, and whether you could go between analytical and holistic back and forth and kind of get the best of both worlds there. Thank you so much for spending the time. This has been a wonderful conversation. I appreciate your time.
Well, thank you so much. And if you do that test, I'd be very interested in hearing your results about those learning methods.
Absolutely. Yeah, if I get to that point, if I get to teach it again, I'll absolutely reach back out. And thank you to those of you who are tuning in to today's show. If you have questions or comments, please reach out to me at nathan@restaurantrelevance.com or leave it in the comments. Ciao.